from the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. We are very honored to have Jackie. Our organization is, next year, will be 100 years old, formed during World War I for the wonderful women, Jane Addams among them, to attempt to stop that war. Currently, we are in 40 countries, including the United States, and our particular chapter, we have called Peninsula Chapter, and we have, beside Jackie, and we have a multifaceted peace program. I do have a little bit of literature on the center table, and it is, if you'd like to get our newsletter, please put your name down there. You may know that we are also working on locally the homeless issue with a group called Stop the Ban, meaning the ban sleeping in cars in Palo Alto. So our range is all over the peace spectrum, and we would be happy to send you some emails about our statement on the latest possibility of war in Iraq, and please feel free to join us. Thank you. I'd like to introduce Jackie, who is the Executive Director of the Western States Legal Foundation, and will tell you about her Herculean efforts for ending the nuclear arms race. Thank you.
So I want to thank the Humanists and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom for inviting me to speak today, and it's nice to see so many of you on this sunny day. If you want to find out more about me and my organization, Western States Legal Foundation, there's some literature on the table there, which I invite you to pick up. What I'm going to talk about today is prospects and challenges for a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. A very complicated and controversial and timely topic. Just about me and my family background, my father was a Sephardic Jew born in Egypt. His mother, my grandmother, was born in Palestine. His father, my grandfather, was born in Aleppo, Syria. So I have deep roots in that part of the world. Although I hadn't been there in Israel, except when I was 5 years old, until last December, when I attended a very historic conference, the Haifa Conference for Nuclear Weapons and Weapons of Mass Destruction Free Zone in the Middle East, which is, I will tell you more about. But I want to tell you about the history of attempts to get such a zone in the region, and a little bit about the conference, and I'll try to be sure to leave some time for questions. So just to sort of set the stage here, I want to read you an excerpt from a recent article. It'll become clear what it's about. Deep beneath desert sands, an embattled Middle Eastern state has built a covert nuclear bomb using technology and materials provided by friendly powers or stolen by a clandestine network of agents. It is the stuff of pulp thrillers and the sort of narrative often used to characterize the worst fears about the Iranian nuclear program. In reality, though, neither US nor British intelligence believe Tehran has decided to build a bomb, and Iran's atomic projects are under constant international monitoring. The exotic tale of the bomb hidden in the desert is a true story, though. It's just one that applies to another country. In an extraordinary feat of subterfuge, Israel managed to assemble an entire underground nuclear arsenal, now estimated at 80 warheads, on a par with India and Pakistan, and even tested a bomb nearly half a century ago with a minimum of international outcry or even much public awareness of what it was doing. Despite the fact that Israel's nuclear program has been an open secret since a disgruntled technician, Mordechai Vanunu, blew the whistle on it in 1986, the official Israeli is still never to confirm or deny its existence. Yet Israel's centrifuges are nearly identical to Iran's, a convergence that allowed Israel to try out a computer worm codenamed Stuxnet on its own centrifuges before unleashing it on Iran in 2010. When the former Speaker of the Knesset, Avraham Borg, broke the taboo, this was written in January last month, so last December, declaring Israeli possession of both nuclear and chemical weapons and describing the official non-disclosure policy as outdated and childish, a right-wing group formally called for a police investigation for treason. That's the conference I was at. Meanwhile, Western governments have played along with the policy of opacity by avoiding all mention of the issue. The list of nations that secretly sold Israel the material and expertise to make nuclear warheads, or who turned a blind eye to its theft, include today's staunchest campaigners against proliferation: the US, France, Germany, Britain, and even Norway. The article concludes, quote, Avner Cohen, the author of 2 books on Israel's bomb, said that the policy of opacity in both Israel and Washington is kept in place now largely by inertia. At the political level, no one wants to deal with it for fear of opening a Pandora's box. It has in many ways become a burden for the US, but people in Washington all the way up to Obama will not touch it because of the fear it could compromise the very basis of Israeli-US understanding. In the Arab world and beyond, there's growing impatience with the skewed nuclear status quo. Egypt in particular has threatened to walk out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty unless there's progress towards creating a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East. The Western powers promised to stage a conference on the proposal in 2012, but it was called off, largely at America's behest, to reduce the pressure on Israel to attend and declare its arsenal. And this article concludes, somehow the kabuki goes on. If it is admitted Israel has nuclear weapons, at least you can have an honest discussion. It seems to me it's very difficult to get a resolution of the Iran issue without being honest about that. And then that's why the Haifa conference was so important. Now that long excerpt was from an article I highly recommend called The Truth About Israel's Secret Nuclear Arsenal, published in The Guardian UK, January 15th of this year. What we're looking at here is Israel's nuclear reactor at Dimona. Israel does not have nuclear power for electricity. So this huge facility is a nuclear bomb factory that Israel does not admit the existence of officially. So this is just looking at a map of the region, just to see who's who and what's what. I even have to look hard to find Israel on here, but here it is. But you can see there's Syria, there's Iraq, here's Egypt. I mean, it's a very critical part of the world. This is a broader view here, where you can see that here's Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, here's Israel. So again, just to show you, China, India, all the nuclear powers are in the region. So I want to just go over the basics of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty because it's an important part of the story. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was a bargain that was negotiated, originally initiated by the 3 nuclear weapon states, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union in the 1960s, based on the fear that nuclear weapons were going to spread to dozens of countries. And so the basic deal is countries that pledged not to acquire nuclear weapons be joined as non-nuclear weapon states. 5 original nuclear weapon states were allowed to join as nuclear weapon states. But this treaty, the goals of it were quite broad, desiring to further the easing of international tension and the strengthening of trust between states in order to facilitate the cessation of the manufacture of nuclear weapons, the liquidation of all their existing stockpiles, and the elimination from national arsenals of nuclear weapons and the means of their delivery pursuant to a treaty. That treaty entered into force in 1970. That means it became U.S. law under the U.S. Constitution in 1970. So here in Article 2, each non-nuclear weapons state's party to the treaty undertakes not to receive the transfer of nuclear weapons, not to manufacture or otherwise acquire nuclear weapons, not to seek or receive assistance in the manufacture of nuclear weapons. Pretty clear? Article 6. Each of the parties to the treaty undertakes to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament. So here's the situation today. Nearly every country in the world has joined the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapons state. Under the original terms of the treaty, there are 5 declared nuclear weapon states: the US, the UK, Russia as a successor to the Soviet Union, France, and China. Who was the first non-nuclear weapon state to join? Iran. There are 3 countries that have never joined the NPT. They all have nuclear weapons: India and Pakistan, which have refused to join because they say it's an inherently discriminatory treaty, essentially enshrining a system of nuclear apartheid, and Israel, which has never declared its nuclear weapons. North Korea withdrew from the treaty in 2003 under its national security clause, and its status with the treaty is contested by other countries. Now, here's a little problem. Article 4. Nothing in this treaty shall be interpreted as affecting the inalienable right of all the parties to the treaty to develop peaceful production and use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes without discrimination. So this is the problem. This is what I call the black heart of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, because nuclear materials and nuclear technology are exactly the same for either nuclear power or nuclear weapons. And here we can see, this is a slide from the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies at the Monterey Institute. So this is an unassailable source. And so we have mining of uranium, milling, conversion, enrichment, and it can go into a nuclear weapons program, or it can be made into fuel, put in a reactor, and the spent fuel can be reprocessed and diverted to nuclear weapons. So in other words, both going in and coming out of nuclear power, you can make nuclear weapons. Now this is kind of an amazing ad from the 1970s, which was purchased by US power companies to convince Americans about the safety and necessity of nuclear power. Guess who's building nuclear power plants? That is the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran is sitting on top of one of the largest reservoirs of oil in the world. Yet he's building 2 nuclear plants and planning 2 more to provide electricity for his country. He knows the oil is running out and time with it. But he wouldn't build the plants now if he doubted their safety. He'd wait, as many Americans want to do. The Shah knows that nuclear energy is not only economical, it has enjoyed a remarkable 30-year safety record. A record that was good enough for the citizens of Plymouth, Massachusetts, too. They've approved their 2nd nuclear plant by a vote of almost 4-1, which goes to show you don't have to go as far as Iran for an endorsement of nuclear power. And it was the US that supplied Iran, the Shah of Iran, with the technology to build the nuclear reactors, which the US now accuses Iran of using to clandestinely develop a nuclear weapon. By the way, there is no evidence to support that. I want to stress that. And then finally, Article 7, nothing in this treaty affects the right of any group of states to conclude regional treaties in order to assure the total absence of nuclear weapons in their respective territories. So, this is a map that shows the nuclear-free zones that exist in the world today. A lot of people don't realize this, but there are this entire southern hemisphere is made up of nuclear weapon-free zones. So we have here, I'll just kind of go in chronological order. the Treaty of Tlatelolco, which is here. That was the world's first nuclear weapon-free zone, entered into force in 1967, developed partly in response to the Cuban Missile Crisis, 33 states parties. The Treaty of Rarotonga, South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty, 13 states parties. Treaty of Bangkok, which is the Treaty of the Southeast Asia Nuclear Weapons Free Zones, 10 states parties. The Treaty of Pelindaba, that's the African Nuclear Weapon Free Zone, entered into force in, well, it was negotiated in 1996, entered into force in 2009 with 50 signatories. And the newest one, which is the Central Asian Nuclear Weapon Free Zone, which entered into force in 2009 with 5 states parties. So altogether, 137 countries are members of nuclear weapon free zones negotiated by treaties. And there's also the Antarctic Treaty, which prohibits the stationing of nuclear weapons in the Antarctic, the Outer Space Treaty, the Moon Agreement, and the Seabed Treaty, all of which prohibit nuclear weapons in their territories. So this is the basis for the idea of such a zone in the Middle East. So it's not just a figment of somebody's imagination coming out of thin air. Now, which countries we're talking about is also one of the things that would have to be discussed and decided. But these countries, this is a map from the International Panel on Fissile Materials, which suggests that such a zone could include all states directly connected to current conflicts in the region, the League of Arab States, and the Islamic Republic of Iran and Israel. So, in December, I went to this amazing conference. It was a historic conference. It was the first time in Israeli history that a conference included a conference on nuclear weapons in the Middle East, included a panel of 4 members of the currently serving Knesset, the parliament. 2 of them, from 2 different political parties, also hosted a discussion in the Knesset a few months earlier, which was initiated by the Israeli disarmament movement. The Israeli disarmament movement is an amazing grassroots movement which has developed in the last few years in Israel, where most people believe that it is illegal to say that Israel has nuclear weapons, unless you add according to foreign sources. And even in the conference, members of the Knesset and former members of the Knesset, some of them would say, according to foreign sources, and other ones would say, you don't need to say that. And I asked all kinds of people, and nobody knows if it's actually illegal, but it's such a taboo that people believe it is illegal. The conference took place in Haifa, which is up here. And on the third, it was 2 days, and on the third day we actually went to Ramallah and the occupied West Bank for another conference there. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. And since I mentioned Mordechai Vanunu, I want to talk a little bit more about Mordechai Vanunu. He was an Israeli technician working at the Dimona plant who took photographic evidence of the activities at the plant to the UK, gave it to the British press, was kidnapped, lured and kidnapped by the Israeli Mossad, the secret police, taken back. He spent 18 years in solitary confinement, and he's out of jail now, but he is still under house arrest and not allowed to talk to foreigners. On the left is Gideon Sparrow. Gideon was one of the speakers at the conference. He is a long-time Israeli human rights and anti-nuclear activist, a really important figure. So, let me talk a little bit about the history of demands for nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East and the state of things now. So, the United Nations General Assembly first endorsed calls for the establishment of a nuclear weapons free zone in the Middle East in a resolution approved in 1974 following a proposal by Iran and Egypt. Since 1980, the resolution has been passed annually. An endorsement for the proposals has been incorporated in a number of UN Security Council resolutions, including the Security Council resolution adopted in 1991, which ended the first Gulf War. As part of a package of decisions that resulted in the indefinite extension of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1995, the 1995 NPT, if I say NPT, that means Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The NPT Review Conference called for the establishment of an effectively verifiable Middle East zone free of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, and biological, and their delivery systems. This idea of expanding the nuclear weapon-free zone to a zone free of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons actually was first put forth by Egypt in 1990. In 2010, the NPT Review Conference final document, which was agreed by all parties, states, "The conference emphasizes the importance of the process leading to full implementation of the 1995 resolution on the Middle East. To that end, the conference endorses the following practical steps. The Secretary General of the United Nations and the co-sponsors of the 1995 resolution, in consultation with the states of the region, will convene a conference in 2012 to be attended by all states of the Middle East on the establishment of a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and all other weapons of mass destruction, with full support and engagement of the nuclear weapons states. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and the co-sponsors of the 1995 resolution on the Middle East, the United States, Russia, and the UK, appointed Finland to facilitate the conference, and a date was set for December 2012 in Helsinki. The Finnish ambassador worked feverishly, meeting individually with all of the countries in the region to facilitate the conference. Unfortunately, the US State Department announced on November 23rd, 2012, which I think was, like the night before Thanksgiving, when there was no press, that the Helsinki conference, quote, cannot be convened because of present conditions in the Middle East and the fact that states in the region have not reached agreement on acceptable conditions for the conference. The US also declared, quote, we would not support a conference in which any regional state would be subject to pressure or isolation. The statement was referring to Israel, of course, the only nuclear-armed state in the region, and not to Iran, which had announced its intention to participate in the conference. The US announcement called on states, quote, to take a fresh look at the obstacles, placing itself clearly in alliance with the Israeli position that the conference needs a broad agenda that covers regional security. Historically, and to this day, the official Israeli position is that it supports such a zone in the Middle East, but only after peace and security has been established in the region. The Egyptian position, exactly the opposite, is that starting the negotiations will in and of itself be a confidence-building measure that can lead to other confidence-building measures that will help bring about peace and security in the region. In response to the postponement of the conference, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon declared, quote, I wish to reaffirm the collective responsibility of the conveners to make every effort to convene the conference as mandated. I fully support the proposal to conduct multilateral consultations in the shortest possible time, which will allow the conference to be convened at the earliest opportunity in 2013. I also appeal to all states in the region to seize this rare opportunity to initiate a process that entails direct engagement on security issues, a critical shortcoming at the moment, and follow-on steps leading to achieving the complete elimination of all weapons of mass destruction in the region, nuclear, chemical, and biological, and their delivery systems. The United Kingdom called for the conference to be convened as soon as possible in 2013, and Russia said that the conference must happen before April 2013, which was the date of the next NPT Preparatory Committee meeting. That did not happen. The meeting did not happen, and Egypt walked out of last year's NPT Preparatory Committee meeting. However, a small group of non-governmental organizations went ahead with their plans to hold a conference on the Middle East Zone process in Helsinki in December of 2012. Issam Mahul, a former member of the Israeli Knesset, and the first member to ever raise the question of Israel's nuclear weapons in the Knesset way back in 2000, attended the Helsinki NGO conference and resolved to organize a historic conference in Israel calling for commencement of negotiations on a Middle East zone free of nuclear and weapons of mass destruction. At the time, Issam declared, if Israel won't come to Helsinki, Helsinki will come to Israel. A coalition of current and former Israeli parliamentarians, local and international peace and human rights activists met in Israel on December 5th and 6th to call for the zone and a world free of nuclear weapons. And the following day, the international participants traveled to Ramallah on the occupied West Bank for a seminar on the legal, health, environmental impacts of Israel's nuclear and chemical weapons programs on Palestinian and Israeli Arab populations. I was privileged to be there for all 3 days. In a letter of greeting sent to the Haifa conference by former US President Jimmy Carter, he wrote, a Middle East free of weapons of mass destruction is a reasonable and attainable goal, adding, I commend the conference organizers on this important initiative and call on all states in the region to take immediate steps to rid this volatile part of the world of these dangerous weapons. So I'd like to show you quickly some photographs from the conference and the visit to the West Bank, and tell you a little bit, read a few excerpts from the conference declaration, and then open it up for questions. So I'm going to move quickly here, but you can see, just to get the flavor of things, that the conference, everything was in 3 languages, English, Hebrew, and Arabic. So this is Mayor Akiba, the former mayor of Hiroshima and the former president of Mayors for Peace. Here he is being interviewed by Al Jazeera. This is one of the members, current members of the parliament, the Knesset. And this is another one from a different political party. Another one, this is a view of Haifa. I think I'll come down here so I can see what I'm doing. This is a lovely Palestinian woman who was helping with the conference organizing. And I got a real sense from her and from others about the really palpable sense of apartheid that exists in Israel. This is just to show that the Israeli food presentation rivals the Japanese. This is Al Marder from the U.S. Peace Council, who was one of the key organizers, an amazing 92-year-old guy. And Sharon Dolev, my good friend from the Israeli disarmament movement, a panel that I was on organizers. And then we went they took us to Akko, an ancient village nearby, and I just, for atmospherics, think that this is very interesting. I don't know how well you can see, it was at night, but this is really an old part of town with lots of cats, mosques, sort of passageways. But interesting here, you can see the Turkish bazaar, the Templar tunnel, the lighthouse, an old synagogue, all these things coexisting in this ancient place. Here you have a sign pointing to a synagogue on one side, or on both, I guess on the same side, a church. And here we have the old and the new together. And this is Issam Mahul, our host, presenting each of us with a copy of a painting of old Haifa that his wife did. Now, we were on a bus going to the West Bank, and on a very nice modern highway, and what I learned there is that Israeli cities and towns are connected by very nice superhighways. Palestinians are not allowed to ride on those roads, and the Palestinian and Arab villages, both in the occupied part of the country and Israel, are connected by really crappy roads with lots of obstructions and so on. So it's just one of the examples of what I mean by apartheid. And of course, when we got here to the wall, this says, this road leads to Area A under the Palestinian Authority. The entrance for Israeli citizens is forbidden, dangerous to your lives, and against the Israeli law. So this is what it looked like. And I was at the demilitarized zone between North Korea and South Korea about 10 years ago, and it looked very similar. Now, this is Alan Henry in the back of the bus. This is to remind me that we were on the drafting committee for the conference declaration, and we were working on the declaration as we drove, but we had to stop and, document what we were seeing as we entered Ramallah. One of the checkpoints. But here, as we go into Ramallah, we begin to see things that look more typical of every place, car dealers, but lots of graffiti. This is, Ramallah is the seat of the Palestinian Authority, so it is relatively prosperous compared to other parts of Palestine. Fruits and vegetables, but lots of images of Yasser Arafat. And this is the Red Crescent, which is where our meeting was, the Palestine Red Crescent, disaster relief. No firearms or weapons allowed on this property. This is a display. Here's a sign, International Symposium, Middle East Nuclear Free Zone. And we were greeted by the Greek Orthodox Archbishop. And he said a few words about Nelson Mandela, because while we were in Haifa, Nelson Mandela died, and it was really interesting watching television, getting all the international channels, CNN and BBC and so on, and it was all Nelson Mandela all the time, and really, for a brief moment, telling the truth, about Nelson Mandela's story and so on. And so that was, this meeting actually in Ramallah opened with a moment of silence to honor Nelson Mandela. And then the Archbishop had to leave to go to some other event. So here we have speakers, Issam and Mayor Akiba and Al Marder. That's Mayor Akiba. And this is a Palestinian physician who presented a lot of anecdotal evidence, mostly about health problems affecting Arab populations, Bedouins in the area around the Dimona plant, and so on. Stories that we've heard, similar to stories that we've heard here when we talk about environmental racism, with Israeli trucks going into Palestine, into the occupied territories, and dumping tanks of who knows what at night. Things like that, And so, again, I don't know that we have documentation in English of this, because we don't have good documentation from anywhere in the world, really. But it was strikingly familiar sounding information. As you see, try to show you the whole picture here. This is an old UN girls' school. And finally, at the conclusion, that's Issam celebrating a successful conference. Let me share with you some of the conference declaration excerpts here, and then I'll go to the next picture. So, and there are copies of this declaration over here if you'd like to pick them up. The Haifa Conference affirmed support for prompt convening of the Helsinki Conference on creating a WMD-free zone. We recognize the importance of the two agreements that for now avoid war: Syria to abolish its chemical weapons, and Iran with the international group of nations to diplomatically address their differences over Iran's nuclear program. We welcome the upcoming negotiations in Geneva to end the war in Syria and the ongoing negotiations with Iran. Now, let me just pause here and say that The timing of this conference was absolutely amazing because it came shortly after the amazing diplomatic resolution of Syria's chemical weapons issue. Now, of course, the situation in Syria with the civil war is another matter. But the chemical weapons have been 100% addressed in Syria. And on the eve of the new round of six-party talks with Iran. Now, those also are actually going rather well, despite all of the other problems in the region. The final session will begin on July 2nd, and Iran and the other six parties actually, which are the 5 nuclear weapon states, also the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, and Germany. And they have until July 20th to reach an agreement on basically what the parameters of Iran's civilian nuclear power program will be and what the international monitoring arrangements will be and so on. So the Haifa Conference welcomes the formation of the Israeli Coalition for Nuclear Weapons and Weapons of Mass Destruction in the Middle East that was built in the process of preparing this conference. This was something that they were very proud of and wanted us to share information about around the world. The members of the coalition believe that the time of nuclear ambiguity has long since passed and that the global and regional circumstances demand a new policy. This policy would recognize the end of the Israeli nuclear monopoly, with 2 options posed before us, either nuclear weapons for all or complete WMD disarmament in the region, including Israel, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and others. Our choice is very clear. We stand for a Middle East free of nuclear weapons and all weapons of mass destruction. 50 years having passed since the Dimona reactor was built, the Israeli coalition believes that now is the time for new anti-nuclear thinking that will save citizens in Israel and the peoples of the region from the horror of nuclear weapons, not only in the case that Israel is attacked with these weapons, but also in the case that it becomes the attacker. We endorse the demands of the coalition on the State of Israel, which include determined and persistent activity to achieve a Middle East free of nuclear weapons and all WMD, and constructive good faith participation in the Helsinki Conference. The nuclear disarmament and complete halt of all plans to develop nuclear weapons throughout the region must be a very essential part of achieving peace and should help ending the Israeli occupation of Palestinian and Arab territories, as well as part of a just, peaceful, and lasting solution. We call upon the international community to support the above demands of the Israeli coalition and further the campaign for nuclear weapons of mass destruction in nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. And with profound sorrow, this conference learned of the death of Nelson Mandela. We consider our efforts to be a continuation of the goals to which he dedicated his life: liberation, reconciliation, and nuclear abolition. All of these efforts in this critical time will help lead to the global elimination of nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction, thus reducing the tensions and disputes that lead to war. We accept the obligation to implement this declaration. And this was signed by current and former members of the Knesset and international participants. So Sharon Dolev from the Israeli Disarmament Coalition sent me this photograph a few days later. It's a fake photograph. It's like a cartoon, but this is Minister Benay, head of the Jewish House, which is a right-wing party, hanging posters on the separation wall. The posters saying that the Israeli government mourns Mandela, the freedom and justice fighter. So it was particularly poignant at that time to be there. So where do things stand now? Well, in the last few months and the last few weeks, we've seen very frightening escalation of fighting on the ground in Syria and Iraq. We now have the U.S. fueling those fires by sending arms to the insurgents in Syria and flying attack drones over Iraq and sending military advisors. However, we also have this next round of the Iran six-party talks starting, as I mentioned. And one of the things that we learned at the NPT Preparatory Committee meeting in New York this April and May was that the Finnish convener had held 3 secret meetings in Glion, Switzerland in the past year about the Helsinki Conference with many, if not all, of the states in the region attending. And it was announced that another meeting was going to be held in May in Geneva under the United Nations flag, which was important to some of the Arab countries, to continue to try to discuss what the agenda could be for a Helsinki conference. And the disputes apparently over the agenda reflect the perspectives I told you before. Israel's view that a weapons of mass destruction free zone can only come after peace and security has been achieved in the region, and Egypt and some of the other Arab states looking at it the other way, that these talks in and of themselves could be confidence-building measures contributing to achievement of peace and security in the region. So a meeting was held in May. I was not able to find any information about it, but just to say that what a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East would require would be for Israel to dismantle its nuclear stockpile and join the NPT as a non-nuclear weapons state, and to ratify the Chemical Weapons Convention, which it has not done, and to sign and ratify the Biological Weapons Convention. So Israel actually remains outside all 3 of those conventions. It would require Egypt to sign and ratify the Chemical Weapons Convention, and it would require Egypt and Syria to ratify the Biological Weapons Convention, which they have already signed. Otherwise, all those other countries that I showed you on that map are all signatories and have ratified the NPT, the Biological Weapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention. So I'm going to stop there. I'm leaving you with a kind of a mixed bag and an open question. You know, I do not have a crystal ball. I don't know what's going to happen. I think that this conference in Israel was very significant because for the first time, members of the Knesset spoke openly about Israel's nuclear and chemical weapons programs with international witnesses and asked the international witnesses to go back and publicize their work there. In the last year, we've seen just astonishing things happening geopolitically at lightning speed that we could never have predicted. The Syrian chemical weapons crisis being resolved diplomatically, while at the same time the Syrian civil war, if that's what you want to call it, took off like crazy. In recent months, the very rapidly escalating conflict in the Ukraine between Russia and the US and NATO. At the same time as these negotiations have been going on behind the scenes for this Helsinki conference and for resolution of the conflict with Iran. So it's a volatile time. But I hope I've given you a little bit of background and context. So I'll take any questions.
So John Kerry had been trying to broker some peace deals, and he met with no success. What do you feel that it can't be done diplomatically from the top? It has to be from the bottom. And that's one question. The second one is, I noticed that you have made a big distinction between nuclear weapons and nuclear power. But I recently heard that the children in Japan are having thyroid problems because with the chaos of the nuclear energy. So do you think perhaps nuclear energy might be a good start to get rid of that, because that fosters the, I mean, one of your slides mentioned it, that's it.
Both good questions. On the bottom-up question, absolutely yes. And that's why another reason why this conference was so important. But I have learned of other bottom-up efforts that are going on too. There's a process of off-the-record roundtable discussions that are going on now involving the Israeli disarmament movement, members of the Israeli government, and think tanks from Israel and outside to explore possible ways forward on the Helsinki process. And they've had 2 or 3 meetings, which are unprecedented. So that's happening. These behind-the-scenes diplomatic meetings are happening. I definitely think that in almost all cases of anything succeeding now, it needs to be bottom-up and not top-down. Now, on nuclear power, let me be very clear that I am staunchly opposed to nuclear power and nuclear weapons and have been working for more than 30 years to abolish both. However, I also recognize it's a huge geopolitical problem. And the Non-Proliferation Treaty is premised on that central bargain, that if countries pledge not to acquire nuclear weapons, they have an inalienable right to peaceful nuclear technology without discrimination. And so that's what we have. Now, I get interviewed by Iranian radio every once in a while, and I always make a point of going on about how they don't need nuclear power and how nuclear power is a bad thing. And I could do a whole presentation on the, which I have done, on the technical, environmental, historical, legal, political, and economic connections between nuclear weapons and nuclear power. As far as I'm concerned, they're practically the same thing. But, trying to look at where we're at and what processes are underway, I think we have to, and since I do respect international law, I think that's, that's our starting point.
Yes, your talk reminds me of a book written by Ariel Shervat called My Promised Land. And in that he had a chapter called The Project, and that was his interview with Avner Cohen.
Oh, yeah.
And that interview was held about 2 weeks before Avner Cohen died. But one of the significant things that came out of that was that in exchange for Israel providing intelligence on Algeria, French provided everything that it knew about nuclear technology, delivery systems, and things like that to Israel. When Charles de Gaulle became president, he was absolutely livid, and he stopped that sort of business only for Israel to bring the attention to the United States. If anybody wants to know about Israel's nuclear technology, go to the French.
Yeah.
Okay, so no question, right?
No question.
Just additional information. Yeah, that passage I read you at the beginning from the UK Guardian sort of describes the amazing international intrigue that's been involved here.
Israel is a nation of, I suppose by now, maybe 7 million people, about 1 million of whom are Muslims, whose loyalty ranges from unquestionable to extremely questionable. They're surrounded by a hostile Muslim world of about 1.25 billion people who would love nothing more than to see Israel and all of its people wiped off the map. The Palestinians actively fire rockets at Israeli cities. Now, If you ask Israel to give up its ultimate defense, my question is, what would you expect the Muslims to do in return?
Yeah, well, emotions get inflamed around this issue, I know that. What Avram Borg talked about, the former Speaker of the Knesset who is Jewish, is that when the State of Israel was founded, it had a very small population. It was surrounded by enemies. After the 1973 war, it feared for its extinction, and so it developed this nuclear weapons capability as a kind of existential security mode. But that by now the population of Israel has swelled, you said, to 7 million people, with all kinds of immigrants from different countries and so on, and that what may have once been a security asset is becoming increasingly a detriment to Israel's security. So what we're talking about here with a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East is a standard that applies to all countries in the region, regardless of their ethnic, religious, political base, like those other zones that exist around the world. I believe the Israeli speakers there believe that Israel's engaging in these negotiations would be essentially a bridge to confidence building and better engagement among the neighboring countries, contributing to their collective peace and security. So, you know, if you look at why should, you know, in many cases, Israel is kind of let off the hook as a kind of exception because of its history, and its history is its history. But go back to the beginning of that history, a lot of injustices were visited on other people to create the State of Israel, and those have to be addressed as well.
You mentioned that Israel doesn't use its nuclear power plant for energy. So where does it get its oil? Iran?
I don't know.
Saudi Arabia? All the countries that surround it? So isn't it in their benefit to work up a nice deal? I mean, they got an underhanded deal, obviously, if they're getting oil. They have oil. They have roads that are really nice. I've been to Palestine. I see the apartheid. It smacks you in the face the minute you walk off of that plane. It's like the worst humidity in St. Louis. So they get their oil, clearly must be some special deal. Well, if they know how to make that kind of deal, they can make a better deal, like quit it.
I think it's really important to be talking about peace and security. I think a lot of people have this idea that we can rid the world of nuclear weapons and without a security system to prevent war. In other words, to prevent conventional aggression. When a nation is afraid of being attacked by a larger nation with conventional weapons, they have the motivation to get nuclear weapons. In fact, there's a case, India and Pakistan had 3 wars. Pakistan lost all 3 of them. After they acquired nuclear weapons, India proposed to Pakistan, let's agree to no first use of nuclear weapons. So in case we have a war, let's both agree not to use the bombs. Well, Pakistan said no. If you attack us with conventional forces, we reserve the right to use whatever weapons we want to stop the aggression. But then Pakistan said, we pledged not to start any kind of war in the first place. So Pakistan was unwilling to agree to the principle of no first use. Pakistan's position is the same as that of the United States, Great Britain, France, and Russia. They all all those nations have the policy of reserving the right to use nuclear weapons to stop conventional aggression. So conventional aggression is the underlying problem. And that's why world peace and security means a world without war. And that's a UN goal. And to have a world peace and security system, the UN goal is to have a world peace force, inspectors that can go anywhere on the planet without veto. This is 1961. Mm-hmm. General and complete disarmament. Almost nobody knows about this. And it was the idea is to rid the world of all military institutions, a world without war. Now that might seem preposterous. Who would ever propose such a thing? It was proposed in a joint statement by the U.S. and Soviet Union.
Yeah.
It's called general and complete disarmament. That goal has been reiterated several times. And was reiterated, I think, in 2009. The Security Council voted unanimously that the goal is world peace and security without nuclear weapons. And somewhere in that statement, there's several paragraphs, and one of them said that the goal is still general and complete disarmament. The people need to know. People need to know about this agreement. That is the goal. It sounds fantastic, but it's the only way out. Einstein once said, "We cannot ban one single weapon without abolishing war."
Yeah,
So,
well,
this is really, so all the talk about nuclear disarmament without talking about peace and security doesn't make any sense.
Well,
So I agree with you, your stress on peace and security is really important.
Yeah, well, let me take that back to the U.S. and Russia, because we can see that dynamic very clearly, which is why I don't work for nuclear disarmament in a vacuum, and I work very hard to integrate it as a broad peace and justice issue. But right now, the U.S. and Russia are deadlocked on further nuclear weapons reductions, much less elimination, precisely because of the dynamic that you're talking about. The Russians call it strategic stability. Faced with overwhelming conventional U.S. superiority, including an expressed U.S. intent to develop something called prompt conventional global strike, which is a missile that could deliver a warhead anywhere in the world in an hour or less. That could be conventional or nuclear. Russia is modernizing its nuclear arsenal. In Russia's national security strategy, that is explicitly laid out along with the expansion of NATO and the deployment of U.S. so-called missile defenses around the world. So as long as the U.S. is threatening overwhelming conventional force, Russia is modernizing its nuclear weapons, the U.S. is modernizing its nuclear weapons, and around we go. So thank you for bringing up that point.
Hi, this is a topic that you've brought up in several of the times in your thing about why is Israel different from all other countries. And I was raised Jewish, and I got to say that I've been very uncomfortable with some of the positions that Israel has taken, that, the laws applies to everybody except for Israel. Israel doesn't have to reveal whether or not they even have nukes. Israel has a right to exist that's superior to every other country's right to exist. Israel has a right to have a Jewish homeland, where I think, religious homelands itself is extremely flawed, because if Israel gets, a Jewish homeland, then we could have Christian homelands, we could have Muslim homelands, we could have homosexual homelands, because they were persecuted by the Nazis too, and it all seems to be based on this concept that Jews are God's chosen people, and Jews are not God's chosen people, because there is no God in the first place. So, therefore, nobody is God's chosen people, and if Jews have something that are superior to everybody else, then why don't you share it with the rest of us, and then we can all improve our lives and raise ourselves up to the level of Judaism, and the world would be a better place. I don't know how it got that way, and also it causes the United States to act like, well, we're the exception because we can go out and do things like the NSA. We can spy on everybody in the world just because we can, So it creates an atmosphere of lawlessness, and you can't go into a treaty negotiation in an environment where one country says we're above everybody else.
Yeah, and I would also say, I also was raised Jewish. I also don't believe in God. But I also am very critical of the greatest exceptionalist country in the world, which is our own. So it's not just Israel. This idea of exceptionalism, we can see it staring right in the face.
I was brought up in Brooklyn, and I was there when Israel tried to set up a state or set up an area that was safe for them. And most of the problem was our government. They did not back them.
Yeah.
I stood on many a corner getting food for these free home places where we brought in the Israelis because our government wouldn't back them. So I'm not sure we can plan on our government backing anything that Israel says. And the thing is you have a small country backed by millions of people who want to demolish them. If you were standing in the middle and had 60 million people trying to shoot you, wouldn't you take something strong and try to survive? And that's what Israel has been doing for 60 years. And they have many reasons to believe that they're the only ones who can back themselves, because they've proved it time and time again.
That's the Israeli government's position.
I know.
Well, I see both sides, and I say, however, if you're taking away people's homes and their livelihood, you'll have to expect some pushback from that. And so, in the first place, all of these settlements should not be done. And I read that the settlements that that Israelis did move out of were torn down instead of the homes being kept for obviously very poor Palestinians. I also work with Lois on the Stop the Ban, the vehicle dwellers thing in Palo Alto, and we work with the homeless, and it's a terrible situation. And if you get people homeless, they become desperate and they act irrationally. Yeah.
Let me just say something about going back to the bottom-up question, and also to address your thing. When I look, I have the privilege of traveling a lot in my work and meeting with activists and others in different parts of the world. And the one thing that I know from my own experience, and I believe it now based on my experience, that wherever there is conflict in the world, there is nonviolent conflict resolution going on actively. That's happening in Israel and Palestine. It's happening in the Ukraine. I was just in Sarajevo for a conference and met with Ukrainian and Russian human rights activists there. And that's where the hope is. And we have got to start identifying more with ordinary people everywhere and less with our own government or any other government. It's the governments, the governments are like gangs, and we're trapped in the crossfire of a gang fight. The Israeli people are in that position. So are a lot of the Arab people in that position. And so I really think that's where our thinking has to evolve. We have to understand ourselves as part of I have to tell this group, it's the humanists, a big human family with more in common with each other than with our own or any other government.